Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you are once again listening to PreserveCast. Today, we are very fortunate. It's not often that we get to sit down with a member of a governor's cabinet, but that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be sitting down with the Secretary of Agriculture in the state of Maryland, Kevin Atticks, and who has been serving in this role with the Moore Miller administration since January of 2023. But prior to that, he had a long career working in this field. He was a CEO and founder of a group called Grow and Fortify. And we're going to be talking all about that and the other work that he's done leading up to this role. We're going to be talking with him. You might be surprised to have the Secretary of Agriculture on a program like PreserveCast, but in their own way and in an important way, the Department of Agriculture is doing a lot of work around preservation. And certainly when it comes to things like the production of alcohol and the rich tradition and heritage that has in a place like Maryland. But before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So in this case, Mr. Secretary, where did you grow up and what got you so interested in agriculture and the kinds of work that you were doing that led up to becoming the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of Maryland?
Well, I appreciate the question and the invitation to have a farming agriculture representative on this. Yeah, I could see how it would be questionable. Like, what is the connection? But I will say that for me, as a suburban kid growing up in Bowie, Maryland, over in Prince George's County, I had no connection with agriculture except for the fact that I rode bikes and hiked through cornfields, and I had a grandmother who grew things, but she grew things in a non-commercial way. She did have a friend who grew for a farmer's market, and I tell this story a lot, but like what got me interested in agriculture was I remember the first time that I went to this friend of my grandmother's farm and got to see that blackberries grew. Like that was my moment. I knew flowers grew, but I didn't know that blackberries that you could cultivate them. And so that was my first interest and my first moment kind of waking up to the fact that hey, we actually grow our food. And that was 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And so when you think about how far our culture, our generations, our community has moved away from agriculture, 40 years ago, I didn't know that blackberries grew. Now, unfortunately, the newer generations, the younger ones, unless they've been to a farm and had that interaction, they will have no exposure to it. And they think that, food gets delivered. And so that was my initial element that piqued my interest in agriculture. It was in grad school that I began to study vineyards and learn more about the vineyard industry, which got me into policy, got me into how to grow things, but how to help people grow things, how to make things out of things that people grow. And so that was really what led me into the career.
Yeah, and policy has such, I guess a lot of people probably don't think of this, just like maybe a long time ago you didn't know or didn't think about how blueberries or blackberries grew. I don't think everybody thinks that policy has a lot to do with what's on their plate or in their glass, but it certainly does. As an organization, we've been involved in this project called Spirted History, where we're looking at the history of alcohol production in the state and how it connects to the the current production and sort of the roots of that heritage, I guess literally and metaphorically the roots. But it has a profound impact. I mean, it's perhaps one of the reasons that rye whiskey didn't come back the way that other whiskeys did, because of policy, and we can dig into all of that. But obviously, that has a big role. I guess for people listening, we have a lot of listeners all across the country. Not everybody thinks of Maryland as such a strong agricultural state.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people think, oh, it's all suburban or it's all urban. There's no rural parts left to Maryland. How big of an industry is ag when it comes to the state of Maryland?
Well, it is the top industry. It's the number one industry in the state. And what's really interesting about Maryland agriculture, different from some of the larger, what you would think of being the farm states industries, is that we are incredibly diversified. When you look at the types of operations, we have an extremely wide variety of sectors and just types of businesses, and you don't see that when you are in one of the I states or deep upper Midwest. But here, and part of it is because of how we've evolved. Part of it is because of the pressures from population and development. Part of it is, on the flip side of that, the access to markets, where while yes, we do have significant commodity industries in the state, we have many, many more smaller farms that are growing specialty crops, table crops, market crops, and value adding those into things that can be sold in bottles and cans and jars.
Yeah, and it seems like it's important to have a lot of that close to us, too. I mean, I think a lot of us learned that lesson. We keep talking about learning lessons, but learning lessons during COVID, where it was like, oh, maybe it's really important to produce food near us. Maybe it's really important to have those things not 3,000 miles away, or even further. And so it seems like it's taken on a new level of importance and sort of a new urgency in this era of sort of disruptions and challenges. Having blackberries close to you seems like it's more important than perhaps it was before.
Well, it is, and we got a clear taste of I'm not going to say food insecurity, but food tension during COVID, when even the wealthiest, even those who have the greatest access to food, had trouble finding the things that they relied upon. Now, there was food to eat, but it may not be the cut of meat or the type of meat or the product that you were used to. And that was just because we have become so comfortable in our reliance upon a well-oiled distribution system and concentration of processing in certain areas of the country. And when the transportation system got janky, then we didn't get the food that we wanted. And that's because we weren't buying it and sourcing it local. If you were reliant upon your local farmer for meat, dairy, eggs, produce, you could find it because that farmer was outside still growing their crops. Like, that didn't stop. But if you were reliant upon a grocery store or a convenience store or a delivery service, you might have been out of luck.
Yeah, and obviously there's lots of different facets to agricultural production in the state of Maryland, and you kind of touched on that we're very diversified. The products that go into creating a lot of different types of alcohol have been produced in the state for a long period of time. There's a long agricultural history tied to alcohol production in the state. How important is alcohol production to like our modern economy, though?
Well, it's very important to the modern economy. It's a couple $2 billion worth of economic impact when you're talking about the entirety of the industry, the direct impact, but then you get into the indirects of I mentioned wholesalers and folks that are in marketing and designers that are supporting craft breweries, and it's a pretty big deal. What I am most excited about is the history of it. The fact that in the 1600s, we've got records of a gentleman named Tennis Paley who was growing grapes in 1776. As he joined the army, we had John Adlam planting grapes in Harford County, in Havre de Grace at Swan Harbor Farm. And we know that when even colonizing, the safest way to consume that water was fermented. And so, we have a long history and tradition. And then you get into, you mentioned rye whiskey and how significant of an industry that was pre-prohibition. And policy came along and whacked that industry. And it is just now rebounding, in the last 10, 15 years. And so I love the history, and that's what really got me interested into the policy side of it, is when you start asking questions about, why is Virginia known for its wine region and Maryland had been playing catch up. We've caught up, but we were playing catch up for a long time when Thomas Jefferson and John Adlam were sharing grapes. And the difference was policy. That's what's different between Maryland and Virginia. Climate's the same,
And so when people say that policy, what in that particular instance, what was the differential? Was it Maryland just didn't make it as easy to sell wine?
Didn't make it as easy to produce it, market it, sell it. When I was first hired with the Wineries Association in the early aughts, vineyards, one of the reasons I went from, writing press releases for them after writing a book about local wine, which was my entree into the local industry, to then getting into policy is, as we're writing press releases about what's going on in the industry, and we're looking at what Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York are doing, they're having major events at wineries when we weren't allowed to have sales by the glass. We weren't allowed to offer tastings unless someone took a physical guided walking tour. Of course, every winery is great and you want to walk and tour them all, but how different are each of their production facilities? But the law required that. And even then, they could buy one bottle, one quart per person, per brand, per year. I mean, that was in the law in 2003. And so when Virginia, the wineries could offer glasses of wine, you could sit there and have food paired with your wine. It took until 2010 for us to get some of those innovations. And so we were 30 years behind from a policy perspective, which, if you can't market and sell your product, there's not as much investment in the industry as maybe there would have been in New York or Pennsylvania or Virginia.
You brought up the history piece, which obviously we're partial to, and there is a lot of preservation of heritage and technique, and also, like a lot of other industries that rely on agriculture, so one of those externalities, the byproducts of investing in, say, wineries or people who are growing hops for beer or whatever, is that the landscape itself is then protected. And there's a sort of an industry associated with that. And there's an interest in preserving land. And there's so many good things that kind of go along with that, which is why it's sort of this ecosystem of preservation that we're interested in. But, everybody's looking for like the value add, the differentiator, what makes their product better. How much of that history is part of it that, sets us apart, that, rye whiskey has this long legacy, that we've been growing grapes here since the 18th century? Is that something that's important? And do we know that? Like, does the consumer want that?
Well, a couple of points. I think the consumer wants to be told a story. It's helpful if it's true. It's helpful if it's based in fact and history. The brand has to be compelling. And since we're talking about alcohol, the juice has to be good, right? Like, so all those things have to be in place. And then you add the hospitality has to be great because people want an experience. And so when you look at the trajectory of these industries, there's from the beginning of Maryland, there's been beer, there's been wine, and there have been spirits. I think what's interesting about both rye, which has become the state spirit, and rum, because of the slave trade and Baltimore and the Eastern Shore being stops along the way, rum's also a historic beverage. Um, and what I love about these stories, when you go far back enough, I'll take rye whiskey as an example. We can ferment and distill anything here. And so there are spirits made from pears. There are spirits made from, hop liqueur. There's brandy made from wine that someone has distilled. And all of those are great, and they're all amazing products. But the fact that we were known, if you look at cocktail books from, the 1900s, the cocktail books in the U.S., it was an ounce and a half of Maryland rye whiskey, right? We were named like it was a thing. It was akin to Kentucky bourbon. And when we came out of Prohibition, where some folks still made some alcohol, but generally the rule was you couldn't be selling it, couldn't be purchasing it. When we came out of Prohibition, our laws were such that we were slower to recover. And there's lots of historic reasons about why Maryland evolved differently from a policy and procedure standpoint than Virginia, D.C., New York, California, et cetera. But just the fact that we took a different path slowed the evolution of the industry for decades. And so now you've got visionaries, Baltimore Spirit Company, McClintock, Sagamore Spirit, who have really leaned into rye and making rye, modern rye, based on the old ideas, the old concepts, the original concepts of rye. And I'll tell you that when I'm on international trade missions talking about Maryland products, and you give the litany of the products, rye whiskey is of significant interest. Now we need to produce more of it, and we need to be, exporting it. But it's of interest in developing countries because they're looking back and seeing that on their shelf, well, they don't have any rye whiskey yet. This book is calling for rye whiskey. And you make rye whiskey, you're known for rye whiskey, welcome.
That's really interesting.
It's very cool.
Yeah, it's interesting how the story kind of expands out beyond our borders. I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about alcohol production, though, they're thinking about the distilleries, or they're sort of thinking about the end point. They're thinking about, which is an important part of that ecosystem and that economy. But they're thinking about the winery, the brewery, the distillery.
The bottle.
But there's the bottle. But there's a whole industry behind it, and that is one of agriculture, right? Like, we have to grow a lot of these things. What is sort of the scale of that in the state of Maryland, and talk to us about the importance of agriculture in what ends up in your glass, because to your point about rye, like, are we growing enough rye of quality that can go into a glass, and how much of that have we had to kind of go back in time to figure out how to get it to taste right again?
Well, it's a great question because in the 60, 70, 80 years since Prohibition to when the industry started kicking back up again, we had relegated rye to being a cover crop, right? It was grown because of its conservation and nutrient value, its ability to hold soil and nitrogen and all. Like, that's what it was grown for in the last 20, 30 years. And it took a researcher and an extension agent at the University of Maryland to do trials and kind of reintroduce rye as a field crop, as a commodity crop to the industry. And it was very interesting to watch that. And the same thing happened with hops and other things where, hops grew before and we just didn't have much use for them. And there's been some really cool research on hops and a unique hop variety as well that tastes really good and grows really well here. So it is that fusion of history and research, and University of Maryland Extension, got to give them another shout out because they do the work to spread the word and do the trials and bring the industry together. And also want to call out the trade groups. So the Brewers Association of Maryland did a lot of work on hops and different grains, barley that grow well here, Distillers Guild, lots of trials on rye and tasting different rye and decoding what the profile of the various crops are. At the Department of Agriculture, we're now working with the Grain Producers Association on a Maryland-grown spirits competition. So we're in year 3, and the products have to be Maryland-grown, and they don't need to exclusively be rye, but it's interesting to be able to try multiple Maryland-grown products next to each other. The wine industry really gets credit for taking the lead on locally grown, and part of that, I hate to go back to policy, but part of that is because the wine industry has always been about place. The maker, sure, but place matters. It is, after the brand name, it is the thing that identifies a wine. The year, the vintage matters, but the place is on there, whether it's Bordeaux, whether it's Montepulciano, whether it's Napa or Sonoma versus Russian River versus Central Coast, whatever it might be. Those matter a lot in the wine industry because wine is all about the grapes you grow. And so our wine industry has followed suit on that. The average beer consumer in a brewery may not be thinking about that. So there are breweries that are using hops or malt from a local producer, but that'll be for a special beer. Unless you're a farm brewery, some of them are trying to use as much local product as possible. So it does matter. And especially when you zoom out and think, in a place like Maryland, we need the highest value crops to preserve our land and preserve farmers as we can possibly get.
Right, because they need to make the most that they can, which is just a function of the economy. And I know I've talked to some distillers who have said that they're demanding a certain level of crop that actually results because they're trying to make a historic blend essentially, and get that right taste profile, that they're able to pay the farmer a lot more than what that farmer would get for just sort of standard row crop. So it's actually that there's a value add to this whole thing. So it's good for history. It's good for the agricultural economy. It's good for the farmer. But you're right, keeping the farmer in place is not an easy task. I'm sure it's something you think a lot about.
Well, we think a lot about it, and that's why we've joined with the grain producers to talk more about it explicitly. And that's because if you're a farmer who's got a certain type of equipment, the planters, the combines, the all that really expensive specialized equipment, you can grow rye with it. Everybody who's got that equipment, you're growing corn, you're growing wheat, soy, you can grow rye. And so the difference between playing the commodity market for 1,000 acres of corn or soy or whatever your rotation is this year, versus also having a little bit in rye, knowing that rye is not being valued by bushel, which Ukraine and Brazil are also growing. It's being valued by the $60 or $80 bottle that's being made out of it. That barrel. And so there's a little bit of translation and there's a little bit of knowledge because it's a food crop, whereas a lot of the commodity crops we grow end up being animal feed.
That's
or
fascinating.
biofuel,
Yeah.
right? So you do have to grow it a little bit differently. You have to dry it and store it and sort it a little bit differently as well.
Yeah, and I think the point you made too about place, I just want to make sure that the preservationists listening are hearing that because we talk a lot about the value of place and about cultural landscapes and about all these different types of resources that we want to protect. And, we think about this in terms of a historic building that has a job normally survives better, but a landscape, is going to stay as that agricultural, beautiful pastoral landscape. If it has a job as well to produce and keeping a farmer in place should be as important to the preservation community as any other community, which is why we oftentimes as an organization, most people listening know that Preservation Maryland powers PreserveCast, and we oftentimes will support good ag legislation that we think benefits farmers and keeping them in place. I'm curious what role and how you see heritage tourism as a part of this. I mean, I know you must be thinking a lot about sort of the policy that affects agriculture. But you touched on it a little bit when you talked about farm breweries and people visiting farms and getting out there. There's a lot of back and forth and tug and pull on farm agrotourism. There's good things to it. There's concerns about getting tons of people out in the landscape and how you balance those things. What role does a Department of Agriculture play when it comes to that tourist component of the ag economy?
I would say a significant role. So through our marketing department, our marketing program, we are promoting Maryland's Best. We're promoting our ice cream trail to get people out to the farms to taste the ice cream, but see the cows and come to understand that brown cows do not make chocolate milk, and all the other information dispels that we can engage in. But it takes someone actually going to a farm, and that's adults too, right? I mean, there's something very different between sipping beer in an industrial warehouse and drinking wine in the vineyard rows. And especially if you do it a couple of times, the warehouse ends up looking the same. The beer could change, but the warehouse looks the same. The vineyards change color. There's birds, there's bees, there's deer, unfortunately, but it's a different experience. And I think, and we think at the Department of Ag, that agritourism is ag literacy, and ag literacy is food literacy. And so, I can stand in the grocery store or at a gas station convenience shop and talk all day about the benefits of agriculture. But if I can get you to a farm, if I can have you see a process, if I can get you to, a poultry farm, if I can get you to a dairy farm, if I can get you to someone who's growing kale, if you like kale, I've seen people go nuts because they had no idea how kale grows. It comes in bags, pre-washed. And there's something to that, right? I remember as a kid that we took 2 or 3 field trips a year, and one was always to pick pumpkins. Like, I remember that. It doesn't happen anymore. It's too expensive. The liability is too high. There are bugs, right? And so we have to find ways to present agriculture in a way that engages the community, in a way that provides a literacy opportunity. Because, I hate to say it, but it happens all the time. People do not know where their food comes from. They certainly don't know where their drinks come from, unless you're a wine trail traveler. If you're out there all the time, you get it. And so how do we do that for the other crops? We have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of folks driving 50 and 301 and 404 to the beach who think it's pretty, but don't realize that stuff right there is putting the chickens on your table. Like, that's part of the agricultural ecosystem. And, go back to your comment about what's agriculture, what's that land for? What's its job? We're in a time where some policymakers think that land's job is to grow electrons, or that land's job is to store our iCloud photos, or the next AI prompt. And we don't believe that. Like, we are pretty clear that we need to keep farming and stand our ground. And the way we do that from a policy standpoint is we put millions of dollars into our preservation program, as do counties, as do a lot of nonprofits, to lock that land into its highest and best use in perpetuity. And one way to do that is to make farms profitable. The other way to do that is to encourage them to be profitable by getting out of the way and marketing and promoting them, but also by giving them cash to put their, easement under preservation.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense too when you're talking about that. Is if the preservation community cares about cultural landscapes and view sheds and historic farms and these complexes of historic resources, it is important for us to play a part of getting people out there because, as you said, over the past 40 years, there's been sort of a loss of awareness of how food gets to our plate. But if you're also not aware of that, then you're not aware of how valuable these farms are. And then when it comes to policy decisions like rezonings and loss of funding for easements or whatever it might be, you're less inclined to be concerned about that. I think about places like in Montgomery County, the agricultural reserve, and what a far-reaching and forward-thinking decision that was to protect that space, because now it probably would be completely gone. And it presents a very urbanized county very close to our nation's capital with an opportunity to still grow things and still produce. There's an economic challenge associated with that, but still they have the land to do it. And that's part of the value of that is being aware of those sorts of things. I guess before we kind of come to a conclusion here, Maryland gets a good sort of national. People think of us, I guess, as sort of America in miniature. We've got a little bit of everything here.
Yep.
Does that extend to ag? I mean, I guess you mentioned the person driving down 301 or they're flying across 70, and they just sort of look out and they think, okay, it's just a farm, and all the farms kind of grow the same thing. Do we have a lot of regional variation, and does that kind of support this alcoholic side that we've been talking about as well? Do we have the ability to grow different things in different areas? Is it not all just one sort of ecosystem?
We do, and that is, and we use that moniker America in miniature all the time because it's true. Like, take the grape industry for example. If you go from Garrett County, where we're growing grapes, down to St. Mary's County and swim across to Worcester County, we accounting for all of the microclimates and the terrain and soil and all of the different variabilities, we can grow just about every grape variety. There are some that are fringe that we may not be able to, but I would say 80 to 90% of grape varieties can be grown here. It's a blessing and a curse, right? Napa Valley, certain things, and they're known for certain things. Sonoma, known for certain things. Oregon, Willamette Valley, known for certain things. Bordeaux, known for certain things. And of course, they've had hundreds of years to figure out, these grow better than others, so we're going to focus on Cab Franc, Sauvignon Blanc, whatever. In Maryland, we're serious contenders in, 40 different grape varieties. And so it presents a marketing challenge, but it also makes it really fun to be a wine consumer here. Same thing goes with other segments of our industry. The fact that we can have strawberries and also potatoes, and also I mentioned blackberries before, and then we've got the chicken industry that's here largely because we've still got large swaths of grain and soy producing areas in the state because chickens have to eat. And so these things all really work together. But with the America in miniature, it's exciting because when you add aquaculture and wild caught into that, we're set. Like, we're good. What worries me is over the years, we have lost our processing, our preservation capabilities, our storage capabilities. So if we're talking tomatoes to the farmer's market, we got it. It's great. But if we're talking tomatoes for school lunches in February, well, that's a challenge that we're trying to overcome. So America in miniature, we can grow everything. Asterisk, not bananas or avocados, and hopefully never. Like, hopefully we don't have that much of a warming change. But it's the rest of that infrastructure that we're focusing a lot of our time on. So capturing what we can grow for use year round.
Right. Yeah. It's that whole infrastructure around it, the processing and slaughterhouses. You don't want to think about it, but they have to exist if there's going to be meat produced.
If you're eating meat, you should be thinking about it, because that's a conscious decision, and we do it humanely, and we create a healthy product. And I keep going back to what happened during COVID, where I was I had a farm up the street from me, and I ate a lot of rabbit because that's what he grew. And when you think about that, that's how we used to live, right? We used to grow things, or our neighbor grew it, and we would trade what we grew with what they grew, and that's what we would eat. And there's still preponderance of cultures around the country that have a much closer connection to agriculture than we do. And so, the further we go from that connection, the riskier it gets for all of us, because it allows us to make decisions. I've had discussions with policymakers. Someone else can grow our food. We need the land for solar until we can't get that food, and then that solar is worthless.
Yeah, and I think the preservation community thinks a lot about this too. I know we think about it, where it's we've had a guest on PreserveCast who published a book on this, and this idea that for millennia, we were the crafters, we were the makers of things, we were the growers of things. That's what humans were. And as we get further divorced from that, those things matter perhaps even more. And so, while we might respectively not be in sort of the business of preserving humanity, that human connection, whether it be to growing food and fiber, or restoring or building a structure with your hands, those are some pretty important and lofty things that we're working on right now. And it's been a pleasure to have you on and have the chance to talk about that. I'm curious, we're headed into now this 250th anniversary of the country. Yeah. There's a lot of focus on the history of sort of everything, and so obviously alcohol is a big part of that. What are you most optimistic about for the future of alcohol production here in this state?
Well, it's a great question. It's for me, it's innovation. It is the fact that the market over the last 10 years has split a million ways. And so it used to be that, if you were a brewery, you had to make IPAs to make ends meet. And now you can be really creative. And we're seeing some breweries specialize. We're seeing some wineries specialize. We're seeing our first sparkling wine only winery open. We are seeing distilleries, as we've discussed, focusing on rye, but we're seeing others focusing exclusively on rum or exclusively on gin. And our interest is to make sure that those folks who are making things at least are aware that we can grow those inputs. And if they're able to make use of our local products, we would certainly love them to. And I think telling that story, making that connection to locally grown, to the farmer down the road or the farmer on the other side of the state, placing them on the label, talking about it in your product description, that just makes for a richer experience. And it begins to make that connection between customer and the land that we've lost.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is, and I think that there's been a huge acceleration in that in the past several years, and in no small measure, I'm sure, to the work that folks like you and the Maryland Department of Agriculture are doing out there. Before we go, Mr. Secretary, we ask everybody their favorite historic place or site. Do you have a favorite place that you could go back to time and time again?
That is a really fantastic question. For me, being a Bowie kid, I go back to the Bel Air Mansion and the Bel Air Stables. And the history that is connected there, the horse farm, the training center in Bowie. I mean, there's some really, really wonderful historic components to where I grew up, and I love them. There are some really troubling historical elements as well, with some of the local plantations And so I do still go back to some of the historic sites in Bowie, the old railroad station, and some really great sites. But that Bel Air Mansion, I've got stories and probably middle, high school, and college essays around the Bel Air Mansion. So encourage folks to go if they haven't toured it.
Well, that's a great answer and just a great interview. It's been a pleasure having you on, and we'll see you out at a winery or a brewery sometime soon, hopefully.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.